Para esta sesión ofreceremos traducción simultánea, inglés a español, español a inglés. Puede seleccionar esta opción en la parte inferior de su pantalla de Zoom. Si tiene dudas acerca de esta opción, le brindaremos asistencia. Si tiene preguntas para los ponentes durante la sesión, puede escribirlas en el chat de Zoom o YouTube. Por favor, recuerde mencionar su nombre e institución una vez escriba la pregunta. Al terminar la sesión, publicaremos la repetición en www.eventos.flar.net.
Good morning and good afternoon. I'm Carlos Giraldo, Chief Economist at FLAR, the Latin American Reserve Fund. I would like to warmly welcome you all to this webinar organized jointly by FLAR and the Bank of Spain. The topic of today's edition is remittance flows and their effects on macroeconomic and financial stability in Latin America during the COVID-19 crisis. For the first time, FLAR and the Bank of Spain are organizing this kind of forum together. I would like to ask Pablo Hernández de Cos, the governor of Banco de España, who will address the floor for some opening remarks. Thank you very much, Carlos. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. First off, I would like to thank my dear friend Jose for inviting Banco de España, the Central Bank of Spain, to participate this dialogue. We hope that this is just the first event that we happen to host together based on the Memorandum of Understanding that we signed recently. As you know, the relationship between the Spanish economy and Latin American economies is very close, not only due to financial and commercial flows, but from the perspective of the Bank of Spain, we are also banking supervisor. Therefore, it's very important for us to build connections with other Latin American entities. Almost 1/5 of the total Spanish exposure is in Latin America, and 30% is also in the region. That's why traditionally the Bank of Spain usually requires many resources in order to keep a close eye on what is going on in the banking sector in the region. I would like to underscore once again that we prepared our first strategy plan prior to the pandemic in January 2020. And one of the strategic goals that we set ourselves at the Bank of Spain is that of building a closer relationship with Latin America. We want to keep on collaborating closely. And I believe that this event is a good example of such collaboration. We also intend to allocate more resources in order to analyze the situation in Latin American economies and the impact they have on the Spanish economy. Against this backdrop, we are therefore delighted to participate at today's dialogue. Today we are going to talk about a significant topic, the remittance flows issue. And also we will be talking about the fallout of the COVID-19 crisis. We know that this has been a global crisis that has taken, however, a particular hit on Latin American economies. Economic recovery is also happening at a different pace in Latin America compared to other countries. Therefore, in this context, we believe that remittances play a key role. That has been the case. It has been a stabilization component over the past quarters in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. In the case of Spain, this is also a very important topic because we are the second country in terms of remittances sent to Latin America. So we are the second source of remittances to Latin America. That's why it's so important to analyze the current situation of remittance flows. We should also analyze other challenges, such as, for example, those posed by digital channels, which are becoming increasingly more important in economic activity. And then also the role of informal economies. Therefore, it's very important to discuss topics like this, and we hope that we can draw some interesting conclusions that we can apply in our future relationships. Once again, I would like to thank Jose Dario Uribe for the relationship that he is building between FLAR and the Bank of Spain. I would also like to thank all keynote speakers that will be joining us today at this event. Thank you very much, Mr. Hernandez de Cos, the Governor of the Bank of Spain, for your opening remarks. Now, Mr. Jose Dario Uribe, the Executive Chairman of FLAR, will address the floor. Thank you very much, Carlos. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are located. I would like to start off by warmly greeting the Governor of the Bank of Spain, Mr. Pablo Hernandez de Cos. When I was a central banker myself, I was lucky enough to meet with the Governor of the Bank of Spain at different academic events and at different institutional events. And the same happened in recent years. FLAR and the Bank of Spain have been building increasingly closer cooperation links. I would also like to welcome all those attending us today, representatives from the Ministries of Finance, international organizations, think tank representatives, and other stakeholders from the public and private sector, as well as representatives from financial institutions. As Carlos said, FLAR and the Bank of Spain have come together in order to host this virtual event together for the first time. This is a technical dialogue, as you know, and this is happening when the world economy is sending clear-cut signals of economic upturn. But this is happening heterogeneously across the world. For example, the U.S. economy is growing at a fast pace. Perhaps we could say that it could go back to pre-pandemic growth rates shortly if the current trend continues. In the case of Latin America and the Caribbean economies, however, they are finding it difficult to recover their pre-pandemic GDP levels. And they don't know whether in 2021 or 2022 they will be able to go back to such a track. We don't know whether they will be able to go back to the growth track either. As for the United States and China's economic recovery, that is benefiting some Latin American countries. So the economic growth of those countries, especially in the case of China, and the increased commodities prices are also having an impact. Then we have the amounts of goods and services that are exported. And we also have the prices of exported goods that have been the result of increased financial or overseas funding and the cost. Therefore, there is also a relationship between the behavior of some countries and that of Latin American countries that very often do not get as much attention as they should. We're talking about the remittances sent by Latin American workers who, for example, live in the United States or in Spain respectively. So in the region, there are some countries where remittance flows go beyond 10% of the country's GDP. So that channel has played a key historical role for the region. During the COVID-19 crisis, as the governor of the Bank of Spain just pointed out during his opening remarks, the remittance inflows into our countries have played a counter-cyclical role that has been very significant. In order to talk about the determinants and the impact of remittances and their effects on macroeconomic and financial stability in Latin America during the COVID-19 crisis, we have some keynote speakers who will share their insights about this, as well as the experience of international bodies, think tank organizations, the academic sector, among others. So they will talk about the effects of remittance flows on the region, particularly during these difficult times stemming from the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm certain that all these presentations and all the answers they may have to the audience's questions will be highly useful for all of us. I would like to thank all those from FLAR and the Bank of Spain who organized this event. Once again, I would like to extend my gratitude to the governor of the Bank of Spain for his constant interest in building collaboration links with FLAR and the region at large. And we hope that this is just the first event of a long series of similar events. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for your opening remarks. As we have just been told, remittance flows play a key role in developed economies with regards to Latin American countries. In the current context, they had a counter-cyclical performance, and this is different from previous crises. So we have invited 4 experts who will provide us with an overview about this topic, sharing some insights with us. So the roundtable will be organized as follows. First, each speaker will do a 10-minute presentation, followed by a 20-minute Q&A session that will be moderated by my colleague Javier Perez, who is the Director of International Economic and Europe Department at the Bank of Spain. I would like to first invite Emmanuel Abuelafia, who is Chief Economist at the Inter-American Development Bank and the General Coordinator for Venezuela at the IADB. So you have the floor, Emmanuel. Well, I would like to thank the authorities at FLAR and the Bank of Spain for inviting me. Please let me know whether you can all see the screen that I'm sharing at this moment. Well, you know that technology always gives us a hard time. Okay, so I would like to talk about migrants. The source of remittances are migrants who work in different locations. So the purpose of my short presentation is to walk you through the topic of migration in Latin America and the Caribbean region, focusing on a couple of events. During the pandemic, it was very difficult to do any estimates, but perhaps there are some trends that we can forestall. And of course, here remittances are important. So let's talk about migration flows from and within the Latin American and Caribbean region. The situation has been changing over time. For example, in the past, most migrants were Mexican migrants going to the United States. We're talking about nearly 12 million people living in the United States, 360 as you can see here. So this is the number of migrants currently living in the United States. And this is important. We have the situation of Venezuela here. Now, there are about 6 million Venezuelans who are living overseas, and this has had a big impact on recipient countries. And this is also changing the migration context in the region as well as its impact. In 1990, all the way to 2010, this graph looked pretty differently. There are many migration corridors that were established many years ago, like, for example, between Nicaragua and Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala. That's another corridor, or other corridors towards the United States and Canada. These are migration corridors that have been in place for a long time and that have dynamics of their own. At the IADB, we have been working in order to analyze that in depth, but actually we don't have much time to talk about many details at this point. So talking about source countries, we can say that about 6.6% of the Latin American population live out of their countries of origin. There are different countries, of course. For example, in the case of the Caribbean region, like Jamaica, Barbados, are countries where about 30% of their population lives abroad. But then we also have El Salvador, where 1 out of 4 people from the country are living mostly in the United States. And then we have a new player, and that is Venezuela, with almost 20 out of 100 Venezuelan citizens living abroad. This has a direct connection with remittance flows. As the executive chairman of FLAR said, they account for more than 10% of the country's GDP, like, for example, El Salvador, Jamaica. But now I would like to talk about the percentage of exports in each country. Haiti, for example, remittances, about 300% of sorry, I forgot to mention that this corresponds to 2020. El Salvador and Guatemala are in excess of 100% of exports. Now, talking once again about remittances, let's talk about the amounts on account of remittances. They depend on the source country. For example, usually those coming from the United States are larger by migrant compared to those coming from Europe. This is a chart showing some comparative data, a breakdown by migrant, not by for example, the Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, they all send remittances mainly from the United States. We have specific studies for Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. In the case of Guatemala, Guatemalan migrants make many investments in their countries of origin. That's why you see this percentage of remittances here. We have also been working closely on analyzing who are the senders of remittances and the profiles of the migrants sending remittances. There is a specific study in this respect showing some differences broken down by gender. Usually the longer people stay in a country, the more likely the reunification process takes. Usually these migrants have already brought their family members to the countries where they are, therefore remittances go down. We have also found an interesting case in El Salvador. In El Salvador, we have observed that these migrants are mainly intend to guarantee family reunification, And since family reunification is one of the causes, their remittance pattern is different, because between Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, as I said before, Guatemala migrants send more remittances for higher amounts, whereas Honduras citizens are halfway through. And in the case of El Salvador, given family reunification, they send fewer remittances. We have also been gathering information about another process we are trying to understand better. We're talking about Venezuelan migrants. About 40% of Venezuelan migrants who live in Peru send remittances, and in the case of those in Ecuador, they sent fewer remittances, about 32%. Talking about recipient countries, as you said before, United States is the main recipient country, followed by Latin American countries and Spain. Spain is one of the main sources of remittances. Now, talking about Venezuelan migrants, there has been a significant change in patterns. In the past, Spain played a very key role. Spain had 7 times more migrants compared to Andean countries. That happened back in 2010. But in 2020, in the Andean countries, they account for 120% compared to Spain. So that shows a shift. Spain still has 4 million migrants, but the region or the flow of Venezuelans has changed the patterns within the same region. And I would also like to talk about those migrants who do not have a work permit or a stay permit. Here we're talking about the regularization of migrants. There are some measures that have been implemented recently. About 1.5 million migrants in Latin America were in irregular situation. 8 million out of 25 million migrants are under irregular conditions, and there's quite also a high percentage of irregular migrants in Europe. So about 6 million migrants are living outside of Venezuela at this point. These are the ones who are the most educated people in the country. And this shows a trend, a difference, or a shift in trend. In the past, usually these migrants were low skilled. In the case of Venezuelans, this paradigm has shifted. And now the question is, what impact this will have on fiscal policy on growth in the region. In closing, and talking about some recent developments, we should talk about flows from Venezuela. There are about 2,000 Venezuelans who cross the border between Venezuela and Colombia every day. There are different migrant settlements in the recipient countries. The southern border in the United States has also shown an increase in the number of people who are being arrested. The flow of Mexican migrants has become positive compared to some negative figures a few years ago. So now there are many Mexican migrants coming into the United States. And then the family reunification process, which we believe will continue into the future. And then migrants regularization. So what should we expect from migration flows? In the case of Venezuela, there is one key message we would like to convey. Of course, given the current context in the country, migration flows should be expected to continue in the future. So those 2,000 people leaving the country every day is not a minor figure. We have conducted a gravity model test in order to analyze GDP in the different countries in the region. Even if tomorrow things changed in Venezuela, it will take some time for the country to recover. It might take 13 years for the country to recover their pre-crisis economic level. Therefore, we believe that should that change occur tomorrow, in the next 5 years, there will be 1 million more Venezuelan migrants. However, given the difference between GDP and the quality of life, would cause another additional 1 million migrants to leave the country. At a regional level, we see a spread or a difference between income per capita. The IMF calculates that there will be 6 million more migrants going to the United States by 2050 due to these income level differences. We should also take into account climate change, because climate change could also cause migration to go up. Climate change sometimes causes internal migration. We, however, have some experience in the region showing that natural disasters and the gradual impairment of economic conditions due to climate change are also causing migration worldwide. For example, the Mitch hurricane caused a major migration flow from El Salvador and Honduras towards the United States. And the dry corridor, which is a dry region running through Latin America, where people are more likely to migrate overseas mainly compared to other regions. So I tried to summarize the contents of my presentation within 10 minutes and give you some food for thought as to what we should expect regarding this issue in the future. Thank you very much, Emmanuel, for such a complete overview about remittances from Latin America, and because this provides us with some information to draw some trends in the region. So we also have intra-regional remittance flows that have become increasingly important over the past years. At the same time, this has also raised some public political questions as to intra-regional remittance flows and macroeconomic and financial stability. Now, I would like to give the floor to Manuel Orozco for him to deliver his presentation. He is the director of the Center for Migration and Economic Stabilization at Creative Associates International. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at Inter-American Dialogue. So I would like to now give the floor to Manuel so he can share his overview with us about remittance flows. Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for having me and for allowing this dialogue. I will try to connect some ideas with what Emmanuel has just introduced. First off, there's an important aspect concerning Latin American migration, as Emmanuel has just pointed out. There has been a gradual change that has been incremental, so to speak, as to the ultimate destination of migrants. For example, now 55% of Latin American migrants are living in the United States. 20 years ago, it was 75%. On the other hand, 75% of total remittances come from the United States, showing the purchasing power of migrants in the United States. However, one of the highlights of this migration phenomenon is that it's the result of a combination of different factors. For example, the fragility of Latin American states or their deterioration. After the 2009 financial crisis, a number of migration trends started in the weakest countries in the region: El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Haiti, as well as Venezuela are some examples. Even Bolivia and Colombia showcase an increasing migration trend since 2010 up to date. Therefore, all these countries account for nearly 40% of Latin American migrants. This phenomenon also shows another important fact. Migration also takes place not only towards the United States, but also to other countries, and also within Latin America itself. Emmanuel spoke about Venezuela. This is an emblematic example, but then we also have the situation in Costa Rica and Panama. There are many people from Haiti going to the Dominican Republic. After the 2010 earthquake, we saw people going from those countries to Brazil or Chile. Right now, there are more than 200,000 people from Haiti living in Chile. Chile now stands as a second country sending remittances to Haiti. So it's quite fascinating to see how migration is now being taking place, how it's distributed, and also the source of remittance flows. In the context of the pandemic, we see some interesting facts. There's a clear reduction in migration. There was an upsurge in 2021, and as for money remittances, there was an increase in remittances sent to Latin America of 6%. That is attributed mainly to the situation of migrants in the United States, those that send 75% of remittances to the region. So here we see some interesting characteristics. Migrants send more money, but at the same time, their experience is tied to some considerations. For example, there are some migrants in the United States who have been living in this country for over 20 years, most of them under irregular conditions, and they have already gone through the 2009 financial crisis. They learned how to manage their money, how to save more, and as a result, they were able to get ready to cushion the 2020 downturn. On the other hand, the rate of unemployment did not go up and was not as high as back in 2009. In March 2020, it stood at 4% among migrants. It went up to 22% in April, coming down to 7% in December. So right now, it stands at around 6% among Latin American migrants. That's the unemployment rate. So that somehow shows, that has an impact on remittance capacities in the middle of the pandemic. On the other hand, we have the different remittance determinants and modes. We saw how people began to save more, and therefore they were able to send more money than before. And on the other hand, there were others who had family members or children in Latin America that shown that they could send more money than before. Therefore, we're not saying that everybody kept on sending remittances. Some of them could not, but others sent more. So the average remittance amounts was about $6,000 vis-a-vis 3,500 before. Therefore, that you can see how transactions were netted out at a global level. On the other hand, there was the gradual change that was also quite significant as for the remittance channels. Before, most remittances were sent using the cash-to-cash channel. That is to say, cash was sent, for example, to a recipient agency to be paid to a bank or a financial or non-financial institution for the beneficiaries to withdraw the money in cash. In 2020, there was a significant transformation, however, because 67% of people continued to send remittances in cash, but 33% decide to use electronic channels, banking electronic channels, or online platforms. That is to say, what we now call digital channels. and they do so for financial transfers. They also use banking wallets, or they use other online platforms for that purpose. So that has been the case over time. In January 2020, 21 million transactions that were originated in the United States monthly were 73% in cash. 63% went from 73% in cash to 63% using other channels. However, there was a change in the use of banking accounts. People began using Bizum or a PayPal, and that had quite a significant impact during the pandemic. So that was a good way to safeguard social distancing. In Latin America, we also see more bank account deposits, and there was also a change showing a lesson learned among those receiving money. For example, in Latin America, transfers to deposit accounts in recipient countries was less than 10%. However, as at July 2021, we're speaking of more than 20% of transactions that are being received into the beneficiaries' accounts. El Salvador has 1 million monthly transactions. 200,000 households are getting, for example, remittances into their bank accounts. Another highlight of this trend shows sort of a learning curve between the sending and the recipient actors, and this has an impact on the economy and the finance of households. So this shows how important it is to receive electronic transfers from one account to another. This has different consequences. For example, the use of money through electronic channels or the use of cash makes more income available, and therefore that makes people save more. We have some projects in progress in Latin America showing that when transfers are made to mobile wallets or into bank accounts, people's availability of that money goes up by 60%. So people realize that it's more and more important to get their money directly into their electronic or digital accounts. This is a trend that we expect will continue into the future. There are certain roadblocks, of course, that we could discuss later. All this saying, this shows that remittance flows are dynamic. There are also some other remarks we should make. Remittance trends will continue to grow. Perhaps they will not continue to grow at the same rate that we have had so far, but perhaps they will continue to grow at a 6% rate. In 2020, that was the only macroeconomic indicator that was positive. And secondly, the state policies still require some financial inclusion strategies related to money transfers in order to intensify the economic development of those countries. This is critical because migration has not stopped. In 2021, trends show that there has been a significant migration flow from several Latin American countries to different countries in the world, but mainly to the United States. This is a situation that we should not expect that will change much. So skilled workers going to other countries will continue to grow, and the recipient countries will have to adapt accordingly to this trend. Therefore, this we can say that remittances have become ubiquitous. This is intrinsic to the global world in which we are living, and perhaps the remittance methods will be critical to economic development and to markets. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Manuel. You have thrown a lot of light as to the current situation of remittance flows in the present crisis, as well as the methods of remittances. These methods have changed towards digital channels, and now therefore we can harness into digitalization and fintechs in order to strengthen cross-border remittances, like for example those remittances that are sent by migrants specifically. Okay, now I would like to give the floor to Inmaculada Martinez Zarzoso. She is a professor at the University of Göttingen and at Universidad Jaume I. She is also professor and chair of economic development at such universities. So Inmaculada, please, you have the floor. Well, first of all, I would like to thank FLAR for having me, and I would also like to extend my gratitude to my co-authors, Adriana and Luis, as well as Felicitas. This is a paper where we have tried to analyze the impact of governmental measures on remittance flows to 10 Latin American countries from different source countries around the world during the COVID-19 crisis. As we have already heard, remittances plunged in the second quarter of 2020 due to the global spread of COVID-19 and the stringency measures that were further extended, the same as lockdowns, and also due to restrictions to international travel and transportation. On the other hand, a number of governmental measures were implemented in order to provide economic support or economic aid, and also for debt relief. According to the World Bank's estimates, there was going to be a drop, and the previous speakers have already mentioned what happened with regards to remittances to Latin America. There was an increase of 6%. Therefore, those estimates did not materialize, and we saw that remittance flows rallied quite quickly, and they continued to grow. Specifically, we see the performance of remittances. These are year-on-year variations with quarterly data. This is the evolution showing this V-shaped recovery that was quite fast in remittances. In the second quarter of 2020, there were some significant drops, mainly in the case of some countries such as Bolivia and Paraguay. However, by contrast, other countries did not experience such a drop. That is the case of Mexico. So this recovery shows some positive year-on-year figures. In the third and fourth quarters, most countries are in this situation except for Paraguay and Peru. So the purpose of this paper was to analyze whether, apart from the traditional factors that can be used in order to account for remittance flows at a macroeconomic level, to which extent such flows have included all the governmental support provided in the face of the COVID-19 crisis. And on the one hand, we have stringency measures, but we also have economic support measures. So in the current crisis is different from the previous one. This has already been mentioned. We mentioned that this was like an induced coma situation of the economy. So the economy came to a standstill, but differently compared to the 2008-2009 crisis. Now, talking about the channels for remittance flows, we should say that the stringency measures, the lockdown measures, or for example, the closing of workplaces, among others, changed the remittance patterns. So people stopped sending them in cash and they began using electronic or digital channels. The informal channels could not be used any longer, like for example, through travelers due to restrictions to mobility. Therefore, this has changed the patterns. So we have some financial or economic support measures, also relief to debt and fiscal stimulus due to the fact that many people could not work. So as a result, these two aspects were offset. This shows the source and destination of remittances for our sample. As you can see, the United States is the most important destination country in terms of total volumes of remittances, followed by Argentina and Spain. Argentina is the most important in the region, but Chile and Brazil are also important, the same as Costa Rica, respectively. As you can see, most remittances from the United States are sent to Central America and Mexico, but also to other countries. Diversification is high, and the same happens in Spain. By contrast with Argentina, where in most cases, the places of destination are Paraguay and Bolivia. Now, talking about the economic measures, rates and the stringency indices, these data have been gathered from some work performed by the University of Oxford, showing some surveys carried out about COVID by governmental authorities. On the left-hand side, you can see the situation for Latin American countries. Right on top, you see the economic support measures that were put in place, and here you can see some of the stringency measures. There was an upsurge in the second quarter of 2020, both at the bottom and on top, but there was also quite a variation between the source countries and the recipient countries that some remittances. This enabled us to run an empirical test. I'm not going to describe the theoretical framework. We are going to focus on the macroeconomic determinants that can change in the medium term on a quarterly basis. This includes, for example, GDP, the same as unemployment rate, and we also trying to draw a distinction among the different causes. I just say whether migrants send remittances out of altruism or self-interest. Talking about the empirical strategy applied, we use an gravity model and statistical method. According to international trade, this is the most adequate approach to take. In this respect, you can see these stringency determinants such as GDP, the foreign exchange rate, and then the stringency measures and the economic response measures. We also consider other data. So this sample corresponds to Q1 2019 through Q4 2020, and I have already mentioned the countries that are covered in the sample. So these are the key findings of this study. You can see that taking into account the most important variables, economic support measures were not significant according to this chart. However, we did observe in other models that GDP may have different lags, like for example, 2 lag periods or more. So this leads to a positive outcome in terms of economic support. This has a positive impact in the countries sending the remittances. Now, the lockdown and stringency measures had a negative impact on remittance flows when taking into account all the other determinants. And this may be due to the fact that people could not access channels in order to get their remittances in cash. This, of course, may lead to questions afterwards, but due to time restrictions, let me now share with you the key conclusions of this study. We have observed that stringency measures in the recipient countries had a negative impact on remittances, and therefore such restrictions to transportation and the lockdown, for example, have prevented people from going to pick up their remittances in person. Also, the GDP in recipient countries is considerably tied to remittances. In this case, GDP is positive, therefore it would translate into an increase or a decrease, and this would be directly tied to a reduction in remittances due to perhaps a self-interest of migrants that during downturn periods are not willing to send money in order to invest their money in the countries of origin. As for the currency depreciation in recipient countries, this has led to an increase in remittances that has been quite proportional, and the reasons have been altruism and self-interest. On the other hand, GDP variations in sending countries do not seem to be significantly associated to variations in remittances, nor is it tied to the rate of unemployment in such countries, but we're still working on this, because when we consider remittances per capita, we see that economic measures in the sending countries have had a positive effect on the volume of remittances. And in closing, economic growth in recipient countries, that is to say, those countries that show more economic stability and are beginning to grow, could provide an additional thrust to remittances. But due to the slow vaccination rate and also the COVID-19 virus mutations, in Latin America, many countries have problems to have access to vaccines that might lead therefore to more stringency measures and lockdowns. However, the fact that now there has been a change from cash to electronic channels that might offset that problem. So these paper contains quarterly data for a 2-year period, and we of course would like to extend it further to cover more data. Thank you very much, and I will be delighted to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much, Immaculada, for your presentation about the study that you conducted, showing some significant findings as to the determinant factors of remittance flows to the region during the crisis. No doubt these findings are very important because they feed this discussion on the determinant factors. And finally, I would like to give the floor to Aldo Dylan Hefner, who is the Director of Economic Measurement at the Central Bank of Mexico. He will provide us with his own view from the perspective of his position at the Central Bank of Mexico, taking into account his expertise in the Mexican economy. So Aldo, you have the floor. I don't know whether you can hear me and whether you can see my presentation, says the speaker. Thank you very much for having me. I would like to thank the organizers of this dialogue from FLAR and the Bank of Spain. Let me start with a comparison of the pandemic with the crisis. There are some differences between the current crisis and the GFC, and then we have the counter-cyclical performance of remittance flows. Speaking about the 2009 GFC, remittances were significantly hit. We are talking about 20 billion US dollars. The next year, however, 2017 levels were recovered once again. This was due to a drop in households' income, according to what Immaculada said before. There was, however, an increase of more than 10%. There was also a drop in GDP. Remittances went back up by 3.7%. There are some countries that receive more remittances over their GDP. In the case of Mexico, there was a significant growth, providing additional support to Mexican households and also resulting in some surpluses and, for example, offsetting losses in the tourism sector. Now we can see that this crisis was different compared to the GFC. The main difference is the fact that remittances did not go down, on the contrary. Then we see exchange rate appreciation. Usually this happens at the very beginning of any crisis. Immaculada mentioned this. Usually people want to generate more pesos over dollars. This happened in 2008. And in March 2020, this may have caused an increase in remittances to flow. In the GFC, the depreciation was more sudden than in the current crisis when it was more gradual. In the first chart, you can see a proxy of the economic activity in the country. So the GFC took some time to spread over to other countries and sectors. However, and that's why the recovery took longer. Different activities now were closed in the current pandemic, causing the activity to come to a standstill. And there was also a different impact across sectors. But now the situation in the United States, the economic situation in the United States is recovering much faster compared to the GFC. Which are the global factors that may have had an impact on all this? I believe that the main difference is the different political response provided by the U.S. administration. You know that the United States is the main source of remittances to Mexico, mainly the states of Texas and California. Before speaking about political response, I would like to talk about the macrostructural aspects that may have increased the resilience of remittances from the United States to Mexico. Mexican migrants are more now compared to many years ago. There are less people in irregular situation. We see that many of them are eligible to receive economic support or relief in the country. I believe that geographical proximity has allowed families to keep close bonds between borders, therefore remittances remained active. Now talking about the economic policies, the pandemic led to an increase in the rate of unemployment. However, direct stimulus packages were granted, and the eligibility of workers who were not able to receive these benefits before could get such aid. So here you can see that the support in some cases surpassed 100% of the income of some of these workers who normally sent remittances to their countries. As a result, many people could be able to live through the crisis. So by way of a summary, I should say that in answer to the first question, by contrast with prior crises, many families in the United States decided to keep on supporting their Mexican family members living in the country by keeping on sending their remittances. Some of these factors have remained in place, and this has been also supported by economic recovery, especially in the case of services and constructions in the United States. And as a result, remittances have remained at historically high levels. Now, let me answer question number 2. These are some estimates from the Bank of Mexico. Most income from remittances are sent to the central northern region in the country that you can see here. The first row on this chart shows the share of remittances in households' income broken down by region. This is particularly important in the central northern region by contrast with the southern region. The second row shows that increased remittances in 2020 reached 9% in the south and up to 14% in the northern region. These are some findings or results as to the increase in remittances and their impact on consumption levels. This shows the contribution of remittances to household consumption level broken down by social classes. The main differences between regions are shown here. You can see also the different multiplying factors affecting consumption across households. In the northern central region, we see the highest level of remittances, where the average income is higher and does not depend so much on remittances. The second graph shows consumption and how remittances grew compared to the previous period. At the bottom, you can see the aggregate figures of 10.6% in 2020, 11.6% on the other hand. So as you can see here, the impact of the pandemic on consumption was huge. However, remittances somehow cushioned such an impact, at least in aggregate. So this shows the impact this had on average households, but the effects could vary according to the situation of each household. On the left-hand side, you can see income from remittances and how they were the most important income for many regions except for some central northern locations where the poorest households are located, and the ones that were benefited the most by increased remittances. On the right-hand side, you can see the sectors that benefited the most from the sale of goods and services as a result of increased remittances. The pandemic and restrictions to different activities shifted the consumption habits among people in terms of the use of goods and services. So as for the particular role that remittances played, we can say that these results show how important remittances are in order to account for differences in regional consumption patterns and hence their counter-cyclical role during the pandemic. There was a significant increase of remittances in 2020. As a result, this cushioned the drop in consumption levels and also caused a redistribution of income. And this is the end of my presentation, so we can now start with the Q&A session. Thank you very much, Aldo. You have pictured a very interesting scenario, that of Mexico, where many remittances from the United States are sent. So it's interesting to see the effects of economic support from the United States and their relationship with remittance flows. Well, since we have had very interesting presentations, we have already plenty of questions. So now I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Javier, who is going to be the Q&A moderator. So Javier, you have the floor. Thank you very much. And thank you very much to all of our speakers for such thorough presentations. I would like to thank some of our audience members also for posting their questions to the chat. I believe that some questions have already been addressed, but there are other questions that should be further addressed in more depth. So let me organize this part of the discussion. We're going to have 3 blocks of questions, and I will give the floor to each speaker to answer those questions. First of all, I would like to focus of the role played by remittances in the current crisis and their counter-cyclical effects. As Aldo pointed out, I would like to know more about the difference here, and also place a focus or an emphasis in Latin America. Another question which has somehow already been touched upon, I would like to know to which extent this could be extrapolated, and I would also like to know about future trends so that we can provide the audience with some information as to the keys in order to understand this phenomenon going forward. So let's get more specific about the specificities of this crisis and its counter-cyclical effects. Aldo, you have talked about Mexico, but perhaps this could apply to other countries. You spoke about resilience to this crisis. How much do you think that we could extrapolate this change of behavior, taking into account this current counter-cyclical situation? Because this has a negative impact on remittances. So when thinking about future crises, could you forestall some new changes in the patterns of behavior? Well, lack of resilience sometimes is also related to the profile of migrants. You spoke about some sectors where there are many Latin American migrants, especially those working in the United States. So the question is, as you know, many jobs are related to essential activities. So perhaps, do you think that some of these jobs could be performed remotely? These, for example, had some financial effects in other countries. And in connection with this question, and this is a question that is aimed at Emmanuel, could you please provide us with some information as to how remittances behaved in Latin America compared to other regions in the world? Always keeping a focus on the region, of course. So what was, let's say, the difference in remittances if we compare Latin America and other parts of the world? Just to draw some estimates going forward. This is another question for Immaculada. Immaculada spoke about some differences between the current crisis compared to previous crisis. And he also spoke about a political response. Immaculada emphasized this aspect. I don't know whether you analyzed the different stimulus packages that were put in place and to which extent this could have affected remittances. Another straightforward question for you, Immaculada. In the case of the United States, fiscal policy support for households was mainly translated into direct checks. By contrast, in Europe, administrations were focused on keeping jobs or employment. Therefore, some migrants benefited from such measures. Could you say anything else about the role played by these policies to support income with regards to remittance flows? And finally, in this block, and in talking about the resilience of remittances, you talked about people's increased savings in order to tackle the crisis. And such savings are playing a very important role in the macroeconomic context of the current crisis. So you mentioned that accumulated savings is a lesson learned by migrants, and this has somehow cushioned the consequences of the crisis. So I would like to know whether you believe that this sort of pre-crisis preventing savings may have had a particular role to be pointed out in the current crisis. And then there's another question from the audience. Taking into account the stabilization shown by remittances, do you think that remittances could become sort of a live revenue for many countries in the region? There are some mechanisms that may show that that might be the case. So now I would like to hand the floor over to the speakers to answer these questions. So you spoke about how working remotely could affect remittance flows. In fact, you spoke about the concentration in some essential sectors. So the fact that people could work from home might have been important for people to keep their income level. In fact, we have to analyze this on a case-by-case basis. There was a lot of heterogeneity. Usually people who would work on site could keep their jobs. Others who had to stay at home, however, were provided with economic support. Others could keep on working remotely. We could compare for example, those who received remittances from California and Texas. In those states, at the beginning, there were many restrictions, but they also took different measures. For example, Texas was more open, and they allowed the activity to continue, by contrast with California. In other states, remittances to Mexico continued to keep a steady rate. Therefore, all in all, migrants tried to keep their remittances at the same level. Perhaps some migrants have used up their savings, but they did so in order to support their families in their countries of origin, given the characteristics of this crisis that was not only an economic crisis, but also a health crisis. And let me stop here. Thank you. Emmanuel, your turn. Well, as for increased remittances, at the outbreak of the pandemic, we didn't know much about this, but remittances were supposed to go down by 20% in 2020 due to the crisis. But afterwards, we learned that in Latin America, remittances went up by 6.5% or 5.6%, says the speaker, either one. So the initial projections were not very accurate. In Asia or Africa, for example, remittances went down by 8 or 9%. So there are some differences in terms of performance and also in terms of source countries. The United States implemented some counter-cyclical measures, and hence the differences. Venezuelan migrants, we asked Venezuelan migrants who live in Peru or Ecuador whether they were sending more or fewer remittances due to COVID-19, and nearly 80% said that they were sending fewer remittances due to COVID-19. So you can analyze data on an aggregate basis or taking different approaches, and therefore you can obtain different results. The United States is a very large territory, so sometimes you lose sight of some migration processes that take place and that are not analyzed very thoroughly. For example, the case of Venezuelan migrants. So it's very interesting, or it's very important to understand what happens with each migration group. Like, for example, with people from Costa Rica or from other countries, because we may detect some differences. Inmaculada? Well, thank you very much for your question. As for heterogeneous economic response, yes, we know, or we have already heard about direct checks, paychecks. We cannot actually calculate this by applying our model, but we can all this and detect some heterogeneous effects considering the source groups of remittances. We have not done it, but I'm sure that it would be very interesting to do so. We believe that direct paychecks somehow give or create the idea that you have more money. So you don't see your account or current account going up, but the reaction to the sending of remittances might be more immediate if you get a direct paycheck by contrast with just keeping your job. Because, well, in many cases, people kept on sending remittances because they were used to. So if you get a paycheck and if you see that your bank account has a higher balance overnight, may have an impact in the forthcoming quarters, coupled with other factors like, for example, keeping your jobs. Migrants do not, however, have this feeling that their income has gone up. During the lockdown, migrants did not have access to leisure either. Therefore, they could save more. Since COVID-19 cases went up, people saved more and they could send more remittances to their families abroad. So more remittances were sent as more cases were confirmed in the source countries of such remittances. Thank you very much. It's been very interesting. So it was like forced saving, right? Now the question is how much people were saving before compared to the current scenario, because now they are saving, for example, on leisure expenditure. Manuel, would you like to elaborate further on that? I believe that sometimes economics or common sense is what you should apply. This is a very straightforward situation. There is an increase that somehow accounts for some counter-cyclical behavior. People did not expect their income level to remain the same despite of the economic downturn. Therefore, you start to speculate. People already had some savings. U.S. migrants had savings in the amount of 3,000 US dollars back in 2009. In 2020, such reserves amounted to 4,000 US dollars, so they were much better off. And they are even getting ready should they be sent back to their countries of origin. So should another crisis occur, they are ready to tackle it. On the other hand, the rate of unemployment is not growing as much as expected. Therefore, they can now send more money. So what Inmaculada said is very important because there's an emotional component to the reason why people are sending more money. As for subsidies or aid, that's something that could be speculated over about. Why? Because if we had specific partners, we could say, like, for example, some countries get more remittances than others. 50% of migrants are in regular situation in the United States, but only 50% got some subsidies in the amount of $800 on average, and only 15% of such migrants sent more money. Therefore, there's sort of a difference across this scenario. Not everybody benefited from economic support. In the case of people from Guatemala, 80% of migrants from that country are in irregular situation, but they sent as many remittances as Mexican migrants. So you can explain many things empirically speaking and put them to the test. So if your income level goes up, you feel that you can send more money, but you have to research your priorities. Remittances went from the 5th to the 4th position. Food, health, sending money, those are the priorities. So now there are many things that are difficult to explain because everything is very complex. Manuel said that remittances went up in Bangladesh, they went down in other countries. In Bangladesh, they went up very significantly. The only country where there has been a downturn in remittances is the African continent, because remittances come mainly from Europe. In the European Union, there was a change of behavior in terms of remittance flows. But these are quite interesting trends, and everything is quite complex. Okay, great, very interesting, and thank you very much for sharing these thoughts. Since we are running out of time, let me now talk about payments. This is going to be a short round of questions in order to, well, close the session. I believe that we should try to focus more on some aspects. Here's the first question. Immaculada, maybe you could like to start. The question is about the cost of the transactions involving remittances. Such costs remain quite high. So which factors are hindering a significant reduction in such costs or fees? Do you think that a trend towards digitalization will eventually reduce such costs? And what steps do you think should be taken in order to see this become a reality? Do you think that there are any restrictions or any limits to the use of digital technologies in order to carry out transfers? Do you think that this could become massive technology available to everybody? So which are the roadblocks, let's say, to the massive use of technology for remittance purposes? And here's a second question related to the previous one. Maybe this trend towards increased digitalization or increased use of cash vis-a-vis other means of payment might eventually increase the bancarization of people and financial education. So that might be the upside eventually of this change. Do you think that these channels will continue to be penalized by regulations on money laundering, terrorism financing, and the like? So could you please highlight or mention what you believe is important in order to reduce costs of transactions for remittances? Immaculada, please go ahead if you wish. Well, as for the costs of remittances, I would like to say that we prepared a study for developing countries, and we observed that this cost in Latin America was around 6%. It was not actually the highest in the world. Actually, it went down from 8 to 6%. By contrast with other regions like the sub-Saharan African region or in Southeast Asia, costs are much higher. A significant determinant here has to do with competition. That is to say, how many financial agents are involved, or even electronic channels. If you actually make more financial operators available, or if you allow them to come into the remittance market, we could reduce the cost or fees. Digitalization, therefore, and digital literacy are critical to this. The more digital access people have, the easier it will be for them to send remittances digitally. There are also some studies showing specific cases where migrants were given specific information as to the channels they could use in order to send remittances. In the case of US migrants, a conclusion was drawn, and that was that if they have all this information available, they change their behavior, and therefore that also changes or reduces the cost of remittances. Digital education is therefore critical. This is also part of the Sustainable Development Goals. You know that one of such goals is to reduce the cost of remittances. So that's part of agreement reached by most central banks. So I believe that if more operators are available on the market, that could be possible. Well, along the lines of what Immaculada has just said, the cost issue is normally approached from a regulatory perspective, not from an empirical perspective or using actual data. The truth is that operational cost is concerned with the market structure and each country's macroeconomic structure. Haiti has a weak currency, therefore for them it will be very expensive to sell their currency. But also, what about the cost of electricity to store data? In some countries that is high. In practical terms, what we're trying to say that what is expensive in some countries, it's absolutely not affordable. On average, people are paying 3% over 300 euros of remittances. 2 US dollars corresponds to the foreign exchange rate. Is that unaffordable? Well, no. If you compare this against the cost of data in Latin America or the Caribbean, that cost is 8 or 9 US dollars for a certain amount of gigabytes. Most Central American and Caribbean citizens cannot not actually pay that amount. Therefore, financial education is key. We have conducted many financial inclusion studies for a very simple reason. Financial transfers provide more added value when they come into the financial ecosystem. So when this ecosystem, that's when the ecosystem allows people to capitalize on their income. Remittances account for significant income for many households. So if you make this possible, you will allow people to increase their saving capacity. This not only translates into more wealth, but it also provides more credit leveraging. Unfortunately, there is a shortage of economic policies in many developing countries about such a leveraging method. But financial education has always played a key role. We have conducted several projects on savings, and the conversion rate is sometimes 30%, translated into millions of US dollars in savings in the recipient households. Emmanuel, what do you think? Would you like to add anything with regards to this blog? No, I believe that all the comments have been very clear. Technology is very important. Access to technology and the technological divide in the region is quite an issue. A migrant living in the United States compared to one living in Colombia or Ecuador have a different reality. They do not have the same access to digital technology. Aldo, is there anything that you would like to point out from the Mexican experience? Well, there are regulations to be considered. We should see to which extent these technologies could be used in order to transfer remittances and how regulations will affect, for example, fintechs or the movement of money internationally. So these are some pending issues, but going forward, we expect that there will be more competition, which would eventually bring costs down. I believe, however, that financial education and penetration will remain very important, both in source and recipient countries. In the case of source countries or sending countries, if migrants have access to more affordable channels, that would be very important. And in the case of recipient countries, it would be important for beneficiaries to have financial infrastructure in place in order to get their remittances. Sometimes, as we heard, the cost may be low, but sometimes people do not have a place where they can actually go for their remittances to withdraw the money. So again, financial inclusion and education is important. Households should be made aware of how they can use these channels in order to reduce costs. Thank you. Well, Carlos, I believe that we have run out of time. So would you like to close off the event? Carlos? Well, thank you very much, Javier. Unfortunately, well, we have run out of time. Actually, we have run over time. We are very grateful with Manuel, Immaculada, and Aldo for their answers and thoughts. I believe that this has been a highly fruitful dialogue. It's quite clear that our region has been positively impacted by remittance flows that have behaved in a counter-cyclical manner, given the characteristics of the crisis at present and the response given by developed economies in the current scenario that shows a different rate of recovery in economic terms. So we would like to thank our audience for joining us today at this dialogue organized jointly by FLAR and the Bank of Spain. And we would like to invite you to join us in future events. I would also like to thank the organizing team, and we hope to see you soon at another webinar. Have a nice rest of the week. Thank you very much.